We all know that for Europe to remain a meaningful player on the international stage, a value setter, a balancer, an honest broker, it needs to, there is general consensus, it needs to increase defense spending as well as double down on its commitment to justice, the rule of law, and democracy. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and most recently the escalation of violence in the Middle East, highlights the importance of a European foreign policy strategy that is coordinated across member states and is just, value-based, and wise, as well as a security strategy that rests on the principles of cooperation between like-minded democracies. You're all aware from our session so far today that the purpose of our gathering today is to discuss the 10 policy choices for a renewed social contract. The policy recommendations that are relevant to this session are policy recommendation number 9, reimagine and make a virtue of the role of the EU as a value setter, a balancer, a standard setter, and an honest broker. Policy recommendation number 10, ensure a union that instills and advocates for the preparedness and resilience in the face of 21st century challenges. So throughout our discussion today, what I would like you to focus on is what ideas come to mind, what kind of recommendations, what kind of suggestions in terms of those 10 policy choices, because we will also be asking people for their key demands for the new EU mandate. But before we open up to a wider discussion, I would like to go to our speakers today. We have 4 speakers coming at this issue from several different perspectives. Our first speaker is Hanna Lubakova. Hanna is a Belarusian journalist in exile, a democracy activist, and currently a non-resident fellow with the Atlantic Council. Hanna, where are you around the table? There you are. Hanna, hello. My question to you is, how can the European Union and its member states strengthen protections of free press against threat and abuses?
Hello, everyone. I will speak about what the lack of press freedom means, not in theory, but in reality. And as I'm a journalist, I bring stories to names, and I bring faces to these stories. This is my friend, Katerina Andreeva. She recently celebrated her 30th birthday in jail, in a Belarusian prison. Her only guilt is that she is a talented and brave journalist. Katya has already spent 3 years out of her 8-year sentence. She keeps joking and writing from prison that she does not regret her professional choices. Belarusian prisons are not 5-star hotels, they are torture chambers, yet she keeps her high spirit up. I'm not surprised that all dictatorial regimes are scared of us journalists. But you might remember from Belarus in 2020 are inspiring pictures of mass protests and brutal repression that followed. What I remember is how people protected us on the streets by surrounding us and keeping us safe from arrests from the police. It was not only unity among Belarusians, it was clear understanding that we need free press. In the past 3 years, the regime in Belarus only entrenched itself. You can go to prison if you like or if you just leave a comment, but no one is giving up. The regime pushed us out of the country, so we reach audiences inside the country by living abroad. They blocked our websites, so we go on social media and we use VPN. They forced our newspapers to stop printing, so we make our own self-made newspapers, samizdat, and spread them all over the country. It works. The majority of Belarusians are against the involvement of the Russian war of Ukraine. The majority of Belarusians is against the use of our territory for the attack, and the majority of Belarusians are against Russian nukes on the territory of our country. Your investment in press freedom, your investment in civil society, your solidarity with journalists and political prisoners, your technical support is not charity. This is investment in safe and stable Europe. Achieving press freedom, however, is not possible without achieving democracy and dealing with a dictatorship on the EU border. You see, if dictators are not stopped, they launch wars, they kill and torture opponents, They blackmail you with nuclear weapons. They orchestrate immigration crisis. They do all these different things. And one step is support for civil society and press freedom, but there is a second step, is pressure. Do not allow dictators to avoid sanctions and smuggle contraband goods to your countries. Punish the perpetrators of crimes against humanity. This is your reputation. Your reputation is at stake. And I believe in Europe of values, not in Europe of interest. It's not only press freedom that is in danger, it's the independence of Belarus that is currently under threat. We cannot allow Russia to silently take over Belarus, to have it as a consolation prize after the war against Ukraine is finished. We have to protect the independence of Belarus. Hence, the only alternative to the Russian world, Ruski Mir, is the European Union, Europe. Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia have already made this step, and I want to see my Belarus, my country, being back to the European family where it has always belonged. I want my country to be in the club of democracies, not in the club of dictatorships. Democracy in Belarus is the strongest sanction for Putin. This is not our own local problem. Without victory in Ukraine and freedom in Belarus, Europe will not be truly safe. My friend Katya Andreeva wrote from prison that we are defined how we overcome challenges and hits of life. So, dear European family, be bold and strong. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hannah. Next, we're going to go to Didier Reynders, who's the European Commissioner for Justice. And Didier, my question for you is, how can Europe reiterate and strengthen its commitment to justice, democracy, and the rule of law, and ensure that perpetrators of crimes in Ukraine and elsewhere are held accountable?
Well, thanks. First of all, I want maybe to react about the comment that I've listened about the values and the role of the European Union, not only in the EU, but outside. Just to explain that after the Second World War and such a situation with the hostilities and the Shoah and many other kind of difficult situations in Europe, we have tried to build something. Something was the European Union based on values. And if I may, looking back, we have started with 6 founding members. Since then, we have enlarged the European Union to be with 28, now 27, due to the Brexit, but it's not the most difficult situation if I'm looking to the actual geopolitical situation. But with 27, we have the opportunity to enlarge not only the territory of the European Union, but to enlarge democracy to the south of Europe, to the east of Europe, to enlarge the rule of law and the fundamental rights, because sometimes it seems to be evident, but it's a real success of the European Union, also of the NATO for security reasons, to do that. And it was possible to increase. So what is needed to do now? First of all, it's to continue the process. And we need to continue to pay attention to the values in the EU. And it's what we try to do. I'm very proud that with this Commission, for the first time, we have published since 2020 a rule of law report on the 27 member states to try to engage the discussion about the improvement of the rule of law and fundamental rights. We have also used the different possibilities to go to the Court of Justice to react against some backsliding in different member states. And we have now, since the pandemic, the opportunity to put a financial pressure on the member states to negotiate and to discuss about improvement in the rule of law, because it's not a fact. We need all the time to fight for the development of the values and the implementation of values, rule of law, democracy, and fundamental rights in the EU. But we need to do the same in the enlargement process. And we are not at the end. You have seen yesterday, with the Commission, we have proposed to engage now negotiations with Ukraine and Moldova due to some progress in Moldova and in Ukraine about the same issues dedicated to the rule of law. And we have had many discussions about the Western Balkans, and it's true about Georgia too. And so, first of all, it's very important to deliver in the EU to be credible when we continue the process. But I want to just repeat that it's a long process, but it's a process with some successes. If you look to the situation now on the European territory in comparison with the situation just after the Second World War. About Ukraine, of course, we try to organize a process with two main objectives. To be sure that it will be possible to bring the perpetrators of all crimes, international crime, to justice. And to be sure that Russia will pay for the reconstruction and the compensation of damages. And what is possible to do for that? First, to work with the Prosecutor General Office in Ukraine. And you know that there are investigations and prosecutions and trials in Ukraine for criminals in Ukraine and for war crimes. We are working with the International Criminal Court, and there is now a delegation of the ICC in Ukraine to start the same discussion. And you have seen maybe the two first arrest warrants issued by the ICC, by the prosecutor Karim Khan, and confirmed by the court, against the president and the woman in charge of the protection of children, but is due to deportation of children. We are working with the member states and other countries having started their own investigations. Universal jurisdiction or involvement of some nationalism crimes. But more than that, we are trying to work on the crime of aggression, the mother of all the crimes, because without an aggression, you don't have war crimes and crimes against humanity. And for that, we have built in Eurojust, our agency, on the base of a joint investigation team with some member states, Ukraine, the support of the US, a new center for the investigation of the crime of aggression. It's the first layer. And so we have now prosecutors collecting evidence. We have a new database in Eurojust to collect and to store those evidence and to exchange the evidence with all the prosecutors in the national jurisdictions, but also at the international level. And now we are in discussion to see how it's possible to have a tribunal, not only to collect evidence, to investigate, to prosecute, but to be in the position to go to a tribunal. My preference, the golden standard to me, is to amend the Rome Statute. And we are trying from the European Union point of view to do that, to propose an amendment to the Rome Statute and to give the competence to the ICC. If it's not possible, now we try to organize a transfer of proceedings from Ukraine to a new tribunal that we try to create with partners not only from the EU, in the G7 and with other partners in the world. That's for the way to bring perpetrators to justice. And then to organize the compensation of damages. We have already a register for damage to collect the information in the Council of Europe in The Hague, but we work on the mechanism to decide what are the real damage or not. And then the problem is the funding. And you have seen that now we have, just to be concrete, we have the opportunity to freeze 28 billion euro of private assets from oligarchs and entities, and we have immobilized more, just in Europe, more than 200 billion euro of assets from the Central Bank of Russia. So we have, the money is there. So we have the guarantee to use such a kind of amount for the reparation in the future. But I want to insist on one point, because you spoke about the way to bring perpetrators to justice. Is the first time that we are doing that during the war. Because there are many people speaking about Nuremberg. I want just to insist on a very small difference. Nuremberg was after the capitulation of Germany and after the end of the war. We have not seen the capitulation of Russia. For the moment, Russia is occupying Ukraine. And without that, we continue to work on all the possible steps to bring perpetrators to justice and to be sure that Russia will pay for the reconstruction. And we are open to do that everywhere in the world. I've proposed and will organize with the ICC, the African Union, the European Union, a conference next year in Kinshasa about the same process, transitional justice in Africa and certainly in Central Africa. And I know that there is now a mission from the ICC also in the Middle East, because I confirm that we condemn the terrorist attack of the terrorist group Hamas against Israel. There is a right of Israel to organize its own defense, but we need also to apply international rules and humanitarian international law. And so we are sure that we need to be without any double standards everywhere. So I fully agree that we need to do more, that we need to be present. But to be able to do something in the rest of the world, we need to show that we are doing the job in Europe. And if I may, we are in a good position to try to explain not the lessons that we have to give, we don't have any lessons to give, but the experience that we have had since the wars that we have had in Europe. Again, I repeat, we have extended democracy, rule of law, fundamental rights on the European continent, and we try to do our job when there is a real difficult issue like the Russian aggression in Ukraine, and we are working on it day after day.
Thank you very much, Didier. And you made mention of double standards. I'm expecting in the discussion to come that we'll hear more about that and some of the apparent paradoxes. Turning next to our next speaker, Federica Mogherini, who is the Rector of the College of Europe and, of course, former High Rep of the EU for Foreign Affairs and Security. Federica, my question to you, views and perceptions of Russia's war in Ukraine vary across the world, as do views and perceptions of what has been happening in the Middle East, Israel and Palestine over the last month. How does that divergence of views impact Europe's partnerships across the globe?
First of all, thanks for the invitation and sorry for being late. So the combination of the strike, I guess, coming from Bruges has impacted a bit on my time schedule. So apologies for that. Indeed, there are some differences in perception and understanding and reading. I think mainly on the Russian aggression against Ukraine and the nature of the war in Ukraine around the world. And I think that we have a responsibility somehow to try to make it right, because not so much because of the impact that this can have on the partnerships that the European Union has around the world. This is important, but not to me the most important. But mainly because I think that if the narrative about the Russian war in Ukraine is not right across the world, what is really at stake is the possibility for the international community to rebuild the multilateral system. What do I mean? For me, the reason why the war in Ukraine is different than any other war we have seen in the last decades is because it has been an act of aggression, an invasion, a military invasion from one country to a neighboring country, and that country is a permanent member of the Security Council. And that is what makes things very different. It's not because it's happening in Europe, to me. It's because it is systematic, or it is structurally dismantling any trust remained in the multilateral system, and in particular in the UN Security Council. And if the narrative around the Russian invasion in Ukraine is not universally or broadly interpreted as what it is, a violation of international law, an attempt to dismantle the international multilateral system, then we would have many more difficulties in reestablishing some sort of global governance, which is what we desperately need today, because we live today in a paradox that we have a much more polarized world, but also we have many more poles around the world. So we have a multipolar system, but we don't have the multilateral system in place to govern this multipolarity. So I think that this is what is really at stake. I'm less worried about Europe's stand and the partnerships that Europe has around the world, because it's true. In some parts of the world, Europe is accused of using double standards, yes, and caring more about the European war rather than other wars that are considered to be forgotten. And sometimes we do forget wars, not least because none of the wars that have started in the last 20 years has come to a conclusion, and many others have started. So there is a certain war fatigue. The other day I was talking to an ambassador in Libya, and he was telling me, well, now among my colleagues, I'm one of those that are posted in the most quiet place, which is not because Libya is a better place, because the rest is getting worse. So I think that we do have a strong network of partnerships. I think we will be looked at as European Union, as Europeans, as a point of reference the moment when we will need to reform, revitalize, rethink the multilateral system. But what I'm worried about is that in the meantime, in our partners public opinions, governments, leaderships, the very same idea of the need for an efficient and effective multilateral governance loses ground. And this is what worries me the most.
And on the Israeli-Palestinian issue?
Oh, I think, yeah, there are diverging views also on that and different perceptions on that. But I think they are, if you allow me to be very, very candid, I think they're also diverging inside the European Union. And so probably you see less difference between what is diverging between Europe and the rest of the world or some other parts of the rest of the world. You already have, I think, inside the European Union, quite all the possible positions expressed, which is nothing new. I think I'm also not worried about that, I have to be honest, because I think that when you look at what is happening in, what has happened in Israel with the Hamas attack on the 7th of October, and then what is happening today in Gaza, is of such a complexity in terms of way forward. Not in terms of attributing responsibilities, that's clear. That was a terrorist attack from a Hamas terrorist organization, there's no doubt about that. But in terms of complexity of the next steps, of what to do, from which side, to try to fix a conflict that is a multiple conflict, there's the Arab-Israeli conflict and this Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's two different conflicts overlapping. Today they are actually overlapping even more. But with a regional complexity that is multiplying itself today, in my view, the attack that Hamas put in place against Israel is probably an attempt. I see this as an attempt from Hamas and connected forces, being it Hezbollah or Iran, to take the lead of a certain part of the Muslim public opinion worldwide and potentially to connect with a certain way of interpreting the Global South agenda. The complexity of the way forward makes it so that if we have inside the European Union, if we have inside the European leadership and the public opinions, an understanding of all the different elements that compose the conflict, I think we have more possibilities to find the right answers or the right triggers for future steps. So I'm less worried about divergences there. Also because, again, I think that the clarity on responsibilities and sequencing of acts is quite an acquired thing in Europe, and I think also largely in the world.
Sure, we're going to get back to that in the discussion. But to move on to our next speaker, Christian Danielsson, who's the Swedish State Secretary for European Affairs. Christian, my question for you is, how can European member states further strengthen democracy and the rule of law in the EU and beyond?
Thank you. It's a good question. Huh? Now, I think the starting point is that what binds us together is the common values that we have. And rule of law, democracy, human rights, that it is. That is it. And that is what defines the European Union. So it's rather fundamental. I think what tends to be forgotten is that we have so far been quite successful in seeing to that those standards are respected, with some hips and haps, but generally speaking. Now, important it is for the EU as such. It's important for us as citizens, but it's essential also from an economic point of view, which seems to be forgotten from time to time. I tend to believe that the fact that we have a rule of law system that works, democracy that is respected, and human rights that are respected, is one of the reasons why we are going to have economic development, or rather build up economic development, and not least getting investments into the EU and seeing to that we are growing and more prosperity. So I think that driving force is essential. Now, it's clear that this is something that needs to be fought for, something that is not given by itself. And that's why institutions and what the DG Reinders pointed to, the various ways of the European Union being able to see to that those values are being respected, by the member states is so essential. And I think that's something where we need continuously to build up. If we would have been sitting here 20 years ago, I think we would not have discussed it from the angle where we are discussing it today. We'd have thought of that is natural. These are going to be respected by those countries that are members of the EU. We've seen that that is not necessarily the case fully, and that's why we need to build it up. And I think what has been put in place is quite substantial. I would imagine that as we are moving ahead towards an even greater union in terms of numbers of member states, we will probably have to address these issues even more and see to that we are even stronger in when it comes to the instruments that are there to get these values respected. And thirdly, there is another point to this, and that's what Federica Mogherini pointed to, namely how we can project our role and our influence in the geopolitical framework. We are, I would argue, in the EU, a bit of a beacon when it comes to international law, respect of law in the world today, and the challenges are out there, and we all know about them. For us to be able to project that, to show that this respect of law is something that is needed when it comes to global governance, when it comes to looking into challenges like the ones we see in the Middle East, or for that sake, without forgetting it, this atrocity, a terrible attack by Russia on Ukraine, is by showing that our system works. And that's why there's this link between the way that we are able to get this respected internally and the geopolitical influence that we will have. And finally, this is not an issue which is primarily for the European institutions or for this town to see to that it's respected. You're right. It is an issue which you imply in the question of the member states. So in the end, it's going to be the political will and the actual actions on the ground by the member states in order to see to that this is being respected that is going to determine whether we are successful or not in this.
Thank you very much. So we're going to open up the wider discussion now. A few rules of engagement. Raise your hand if you want to be given the floor. Introduce yourself before speaking, please. No speeches, and we're prioritizing recommendations. So if you have something specific to say about those two policy recommendations, and just to revisit them very quickly, reimagine and make a virtue of the role of the EU as a value setter, a balancer, a standard setter, an honest broker. And number two, ensure a union that instills in advocates for preparedness and resilience in the face of 21st century challenges. So I'm going to take interventions in batches of 3. So show of hands. Okay, just here to my right. Here. Okay, well, there are roving mics, so just here. Introduce yourself.
Thank you. My name is Giedrius Surplis. I come from Lithuanian Parliament, a member of Parliament and the deputy head of the Foreign Affairs Committee. So I'm sure you know what I'm going to say. From the Baltics, there is a very simple way of ensuring stability and sustainable peace in Europe. It's defeating Russia. So I know that it's not easy, but just a provocation. We have to digest this question, and I know that parts of Europe are digesting it differently, but we have to just imagine what would happen if Russia lost. It is possible, and Ukraine is proving us that. So we have to support Ukraine, and by doing that, by assisting Ukraine, we can really see sustainable sustainable peace coming back to Europe. And you know, I was listening to what the speakers were saying. Actually, if we ask ourselves how the EU started, because of what conditions it was created, it started because of war in Europe. And what we have now as an idealistic community, as an idealistic union, is basically stemming from a really realistic approach to international relations rather than idealistic. So we were having a dream about idealism, you know, that you can trade with Russia, that you can invest, you know, the neighborhood money, the Interreg money, and that it would be European. It just hasn't worked. Okay. So I think before asking ourselves what the EU can do as a broker of peace and stability in the world, we have to turn back to ourselves and, you know, coming back to your concrete question, thinking about the future, yes, we must invest in defense. I'm sorry, but it's true. Yes, we must ensure energy security and well, autonomy.
Okay.
Yes, we have to reconsider whether our EU humanitarian funds shouldn't be followed by our value export.
Okay.
Because of what we saw in done by the Hamas. So these are the questions. Let's get back and consider whether we need more realism rather than idealism.
Thank you. We're going to go to Alessandra now, who is our Debating Europe facilitator, who will offer some citizens' perspectives on the focus of the discussion.
Thank you so much. Yes, indeed. So I'm speaking on behalf of the citizens from 7 EU countries that we are involved in a series of discussions on several topics, including security, democracy. And there are a couple of points that after listening to you, come to my mind from the conversation we had with citizens. One is about press freedom. Ms. Lubakova, sorry for the pronunciation, you said it very well, and indeed we had a Polish, in particular, citizen who mentioned that for him, when thinking about a healthy democracy, it's about media freedom, but also quality of media from the public, but also private sector. We know that in some countries, public media are basically propaganda tools. So it's also important to remember about the private owned media responsibility as well. And of course, we think also of social media platforms. And then another point that I want to mention, a bit of provocation here, is about Europe as a value setter. But what about the perception of a sort of new colonial Europe as value setter, which is something that we need, I guess, to bear in mind when thinking about our role in the globe and the perception, especially for young people that are very sensitive to this. And lastly, but not least, 2 points. One, we're talking about security values, rule of law, justice. What about corruption and organized crime? These are things that came up, especially as you can imagine from Italian participants that are very concerned about these issues, though it's a European issue, we all know, and global one. And last but not least, digital. So when we talk about security, we cannot forget about cyber security. And in the previous session about digital, I didn't have the time to raise the point on how can Europe become a digital superpower, including cybersecurity, and not depending on other international sort of digital companies and so on. So our strategic autonomy in terms of digital cybersecurity, and of course, media literacy. So we need to have citizens understanding the importance of digital security and cybersecurity as well. So different aspects about security as well.
Thank you, Alessandra. Can I go back to you, Federica, on that, and specifically what Alessandra said, this idea of this perception of a neo-colonial Europe. We know that and you obliquely referred to it in your comments earlier, the decolonization narrative, movement, quite a nebulous kind of concept in many ways, but it has gained incredible traction amongst the young generation in Africa, in the Middle East, in Asia, in Europe and the US. It's also been weaponized by certain states. What's your take on that, this idea of neo-colonial Europe, the decolonization framework being the lens that a lot of foreign policy issues are viewed through by a considerable number of Europeans as well?
You know, yesterday at the college in Bruges, we had the honor of hosting the president of Malta. And this question came from some of our students, and he said, well, we were a colony, and we're today a member state. This to say that I think we have, sometimes we have difficulties inside the European Union to realize to what extent the European Union membership is diverse. If you consider the number of member states, I would say that less than half has been a colonial power, and some have been colonies in different forms. Sometimes we have difficulties in building a narrative about this diversity of Europe abroad. I've noticed, for instance, myself personally, that being of a certain nationality or another can have an impact with your capacity to relate to interlocutors around the world. Being an Italian in Libya or in the Horn of Africa is different than being an Italian in Argentina, as well as being a Spanish in, India is different than being a Spanish in Cuba. And I could continue without mentioning any Belgian examples. This to say that I think that here we have a lot of work to do as the European Union to build a narrative that goes beyond the perception of some individual member states. Some individual member states have a colonial past that is heavy, with which some of them are, well, all of them are working in one way or another. As Daniel mentioned, as Christian mentioned, this is something for member states to deal with. It's not for the European Union. I think that as European Union, we should develop more a narrative of the fact that the European Union as such is definitely not, it is not possible to identify it with a colonial or post-colonial power because of its diversity. Then there is another thing that is more complex and more subtle to address, and that is that this narrative in some of our partners and in some of the public opinion has very little to do with the history and has a lot to do with the normative power of the European Union. And here I think we have to be very bold. Being a normative power worldwide has nothing to do with being post-colonial. It is about setting the standards for international norms to be held accountable to and to be strong. The stronger we are on the credibility of handling our or some of our member states' colonial past, the stronger we can be on being a normative power worldwide without being accused of imposing norms and standards because of post-colonial dynamics. We have to break that link.
Very interesting. Back to the floor, interventions, show of hands. So we have this lady here. Welcome.
Hello, I'm Liisa Pakosta from Estonian Parliament, Chair of the European Union Affairs Committee. And I just follow your point on normative power and credibility. For credibility, we actually need some ammo. So one of the policy recommendations for European Union is to raise the market barriers and other normative barriers from the defense industry. And really, the defense industry has long been considered here as an area similar to porn industry, and it is not right. So there is no democracy under occupation. All the Baltic countries can tell you long stories about it. And the second recommendation is that the AI regulations and defense industry should be on different sides. So if we regulate the defense industry and AI, our sons and daughters will die on the battlefield fighting against the powers who didn't regulate AI and defense industry. So and the third thing is, we really have to get over Hungary and give the money to Ukraine. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you. And over to Malcolm.
Thank you, Mary. Malcolm Byrne is my name. I'm a senator in Ireland. And I want to come back to a comment that Jasminko made. If we're going to talk about, security and values, and you made the very valid point that when your childhood is affected by war, that stays with you. And your values are shaped by, your experiences in life. That was why the European Union came about. It was because of a generation that were impacted by what had happened in the Second World War and its immediate aftermath. And I think we're kind of all lucky. We're kind of within a bubble here in that we're all in positions whereby we regularly interact, with people from other countries. We engage in these big issues. The real challenge is around ensuring that all of our citizens within Europe are able to interact and engage. Because the best way to have security is not by building fences and walls, but it's by building mutual understanding and good relationships. One of the most successful EU programs has been the Erasmus program, which has allowed student exchange. I would even argue, and I think it needs to go further, the Discover EU Pass, which allows 18-year-olds to travel around the European Union. We should be ambitious and look at giving that to every 18-year-old around the European Union, because whether you're coming from a colonial power, a former colonial power, or indeed a colonized country or whatever, the best way to build understanding is through exchange, is to be able to sit around and to talk about a lot of our histories. And in many ways, therefore, we need to build that 21st century citizen, to be able for everybody to understand those security and values. But it comes back to some of the points earlier. Those values need to be asserted and defended, and they need to be in many ways in three places, and I'll conclude on this. They need to be defended internally within the European Union. There can't be any hypocrisy on the part of member states with regard to democracy, human rights and the rule of law. They need to be geopolitically defended, and we shouldn't make any apologies, particularly, and I do believe we need to argue for trade as well, but trade on just terms, and then also in the digital space, whether it's in the metaverse or whatever. But I think, to your point about AI, the AI Act has the potential to be the most significant piece of legislation that the European Union will enact this decade. And it has to be infused with people-centered values. And that's why I think we do need to look at that concept of a 21st century citizenship infused with the values that we believe to be important.
Thanks, Malcolm. We'll go over to Ana now. Do we have a mic? There you go.
I'm Ana Gomes from Portugal, a former member of the European Parliament, a socialist. I think we may have wonderful rules for global governance, wonderful institutions, but if we don't have moral authority, if we don't have consistency, we don't have credibility in imposing and imparting them. And this is the problem of Europe in this moment. We can't continue to have double standards. We can't stay there for Ukraine and indeed denounce and fight the aggression and the occupation by Russia if we don't see the occupation in Palestine. We can't impose one way of self-defense. And by the way, we've been pretty inconsistent in Ukraine, and we know very well how much we denied, for instance, the means that Ukraine needed to defend itself in order to not to provoke escalation by Russia. And little by little, we have been, of course, but too little, too late, giving these means to Ukraine, and then at the same time allowing Israel to completely make a joke of international humanitarian law, the rules of the war. So the problem is this lack of inconsistency, is this lack of moral, indeed, living up to our values and to indeed global the values that we want to instill in all over the world for global governance. So how can we? We never, for instance, on the reform of the UN Security Council, we never pushed for it, even when we could, when we had even Britain inside the European Union. But obviously the P5, none of them has an interest in changing that. So we have global governance totally blocked, unable to work. But we will never be able to do that if indeed we don't have a moral voice, and we don't have it in this moment. And this has a lot to do, and actually, who's winning is Russia, I'm sorry to tell you. They are winning in every way, and even in the corruption they have been infiltrating in us. This is part of the problem. And it's why our young people are in many places very discouraged with what is going on. Until we tackle that, we won't be able to indeed change the perception, and we won't make a difference for good. Sorry to tell you.
And to follow up from that, and not to bombard you with questions, Federica, but I work on the MENA region more generally, and within the policy analyst community, the question over the last month has been, who speaks for Europe? Because your successor, for quite some time after October 7th, appeared to be completely sidelined. So this question of who speaks for Europe, who goes where, when, and who is the face of Europe, and what happens when there seems to be a divergence of views on a particular situation.
Didier, you want to reply?
Are we chat a mouse? No, we're not. We're recorded everywhere. Good. You want? I have the standard line to take. You look at the treaties. It's clear who speaks on foreign policy for the European Union. And that's it. That's the correct institutional answer, right? I speak here under the control of two former colleagues. Reality is that beyond the treaties, there's politics and personalities and dynamics. And one thing that doesn't exist in politics and in foreign policy either is the vacuum. So the space is, let's put it this way. You have the treaty provisions, which are clear, who speaks for the European Union international scene, the telephone number, and which institution has the responsibility of leading on foreign and security policy. That's clear, that's the Council. But then there's also the reality of the fact that institutions and people leading institutions have a voice and have a recognition and have sometimes a credibility in certain audiences. Personally, again, I know sometimes I'm accused of being too optimistic and to see things more, rosy than they are, but this shows that it was not included in the contract. I'm really like that, so I continue being like that even now that I don't have to. I'm personally not so much worried about who speaks for Europe and when and who goes where, provided that the voice of Europe is coordinated and is clear. That's the point. I always opposed the concept of speaking with one voice because I think that one of the strengths of Europe is having more voices, because the voice that you can hear in different parts of Europe, because of the difference in geography, in history, in politics, is relevant because it gives us this complexity, this understanding of complexity that we can understand because we have it inside. So I'm happy when we have several voices. The point is to sing the same song with different voices. So the point to me is not who speaks. The point is which message is convened. Then by whom, I care a bit less. Obviously, by all in principle. But the point is, does the coordination mechanism, does the interinstitutional coordination mechanism that allows the European Union to have a univocal, coherent message work? That is a different story.
And we've been talking about the EU as an honest broker. Do you think that, given the way Europe has handled, the EU has handled the Israeli-Palestinian situation over the last month, its credibility as an honest broker in the future regarding that file has been damaged?
I think, there's an Italian say that is very wise. It's actually a regional say that goes like this. I'm too little if I consider myself, but I'm big enough if I compare myself with others. I think the European Union is the most honest broker you can find around the world on the Palestinian-Israeli issue still. And I think we will remain so. We will never be able to solve or fix the two conflicts, Israel-Palestinian, and potentially the multiplication of that. Hopefully not, but it could be region-wise and worldwide, hopefully not. We will never be able to fix it alone. There are very few situations where one single power in the world can fix a crisis alone today. In Europe, I think we still have that power in some regions, take the Balkans, for instance, very few others. For sure, we will not be able to fix the Middle East alone, but I think it's impossible to fix the conflicts there without the European Union as one of the brokers, of the honest brokers, yes. And again, if you compare it with other players in the world, we're definitely the most honest one.
Okay, back to the floor. Yasminko, you wanted to come in again, and we had another hand here. Any other hands? Here, okay, well, Yasminko.
Yes, just to connect briefly to what has been said about Europe, first thinking that giving thanks to Ukraine is too much, and then committing thanks when the fields were already mined, so it was too late. So it's not only to do the right thing, but also to do it timely. And then also to connect to what was said now, that Europe maybe has in one single place in this world the power to change things on its own and its Balkans, Western Balkans. But this also will not last forever. And again, it's important to do it timely. And I think security, one of the aspects of European security is also its enlargement policy. And this is much more than how rich this union will be. And this is much more than some distant place that sounds when you say Western Balkans. I'm from Bosnia and Herzegovina. We are part of this Western Balkans. And our longest border is border with European Union. So we are on the border of European Union. It's Croatia. And I don't know how many of you in this room know, but a few weeks ago, one of the leading politicians from my country went to Russia, to Moscow, met Putin, and awarded him with a medal. Europe needs to act, not to react. This is a big issue. It will be much more expensive, it will be much more difficult, and it will be impossible, just like now it's impossible to solve and influence some things in the world if new war starts in the Balkans. So this is just another thing which I think we should keep.
Thank you, Yasminko. And over here, Mike here.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Michael Meyer-Resende from Democracy Reporting International, an NGO based in Berlin with a number of offices around the world, in particular also in the Middle East and North Africa. I wanted to come back to one remark of Commissioner Reinders, who said when the EU was founded, it was founded on democracy. And I think if we look back at that time, it was clear that building a democracy was an issue of hard policy. It was not easy. It was not self-evident. And I think over the decades, we have forgotten this a bit. And the idea became, well, democracy is about values. That's nice. That's idealistic. That's for people like me in the NGOs. But it hasn't so much to do with hard foreign policy. And I think this we really have to change, because we see how dangerous autocracy is. Russia is, of course, exhibit A, but we can mention many others. And that we take internal development in other countries very, very seriously, for their own citizens, of course, but also for the security in the world. And I think a lot more can be done to bring the thinking into our foreign policy and to be more subtle about how we set standards, how we establish them, and how we intervene in that space. And the second remark is just on, to come back to you, Federica Mogherini, on the Gaza issue. So I'm less sanguine, I have to say. As I said, we are very rooted in the region. And the feedback I now get from colleagues is really, really different from what I had before. And, you know, there were many Gaza wars, and there was a Lebanon war, etc. I feel this is going much deeper now, maybe because the world has changed, maybe because there's more this idea about decolonization, etc. And I think if we as the European Union are not able to say, if you cut off water and electricity of 2 million people, this is completely unacceptable, and we don't stand by it, and we cannot support that, then we lose our values. And I'm specifically picking this because there are many different opinions. It's a complex situation. 7th October was a horrible massacre. I'm there, you know, I'm not, I think I'm pretty middle of the road on this, but there are few things that you can very clearly identify that the Israeli army is doing that are absolutely unacceptable. And we just discuss them as if they aren't there, and we don't stand up and say, sorry, that we cannot support, and in a serious way, not just by declarations. Thank you.
Thank you. And then over to Paul here.
Thanks, Mary. I'm the rapporteur of this session, so I probably shouldn't speak, but I just wanted to quickly, and I'm glad that the previous speaker mentioned the massacre of the 7th of October, because I hadn't heard any of the people who were so indignant about what the Israelis are doing now even mention it. So let us beware of selective indignation, and let us remember that among the children, the first children that were killed in this instance were Israeli children in their beds, in their homes. So I'm sorry, but you know, that somehow there's a lot of reversal going on here. And let's remember just who Hamas is. Hamas is an organization that has been characterized by the European Union on numerous occasions as a terrorist organization, which has a charter which is about destroying Israel completely and killing Jews. and which includes some of the old anti-Semitic tropes that have been around for centuries, such as the protocols of the Elders of Zion. So while I too share the general upset and commiseration and indignation about some of the things happening to civilians in the Gaza Strip, which is a crowded area where Hamas are deeply embedded and fighting among the people and using the people to protect them, I think we should really beware of selective indignation. My other point, very briefly, as I'm one of the people who had the task of co-drafting some of these recommendations, is to say that this is a union, we are a union of values and interests. We've talked this afternoon almost exclusively about ourselves as a union of values. And of course we have values, but we also have interests, and to elide that is kind of illusory in my view. And those interests include our core interest in keeping our society and our democracy safe and secure. That requires investments. It requires investments in defense. It requires big investments in resilience, some of which we heard about this morning. But I think that you know, there's a risk that we see ourselves as being purely a peace-loving, values-promoting union in a world that is increasingly hostile, as we see all around us. So let us be honest about our values and our interests, and let us also be honest about the need for our society to defend itself and defend our democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Before we go to our speakers for closing remarks, I'm going to do one final round. We have this lady here.
I would like, there are so many interesting points here, so I would like to confine myself to what it was said about Gaza. You might know that, well, thinking forward beyond the war, we have this kind of EMEC project, which is a corridor linking Europe to India through the Arabian Gulf. I think that despite the war, we need to continue to be motivated, because only this kind of connectivity, digital and green bridge can bring stability in the region. And of course, this war, I hope it will not escalate. I hope that we will find a solution, and the European Union will be able to act like as a honest broker with the support of people, with the countries in the region. But we need to keep an eye on this kind of infrastructure project, which was launched on the occasion of G20. Okay. And to have this kind of, optimistic view, and while working on the war, of course, which we know very well the situation and this kind of divergent views of the European Union. So we need to converge through something positive. Thank you.
So 2 more interventions. This lady here, and any other hand? Go over to you.
Good afternoon to everyone. I hope you can hear me. I'm Rekena from the Lifelong Learning Platform, European Civil Society for Education and Training. So I wear 2 hats, education on one side and civil society on the other side. And I do see them both as very important in this discussion, as indeed through education we can teach young people those values and to live by those values. But in order to do so, we need to give example. And I agree on what was said before, that we should take responsibility, and that means also revising our curricula in a way that is decolonized, which is very important, and we need to take into consideration where we stand at the moment and how young people are completely polarized on these issues, and we are failing them in many ways because they are feeling unsafe as never before. And this is something that we need to reflect even more, because if we fail young people today, as it was mentioned, we failed them forever, and it will be much more harder for Europe to get them back. So I think it's very important to use what Europe has probably succeeded to, and it was mentioned by our Irish colleagues. Erasmus Plus is certainly an example. It's one of the most successful projects of the European Union, when the only one where actually we have managed to go to citizens at the very grassroots levels and created some kind of European identity that no other EU policies has created. So let's use it. So if I can recommend, definitely use that as a vehicle to build these values and to live by those values. But first of all, we have to avoid double standards, because my family is shared between Western Balkans, Europe and Africa, and I can tell you that at the moment Africa is starting to hate Europe, and this is a major risk for our security, but in general it's a major risk for society that we are falling apart from each other.
Thank you. So now we'll go to our initial speakers for their closing remarks. What I would like all four of you to do is draw on everything you've heard during the session, respond to whatever you'd like to respond to, but also basically give us one demand for the next EU mandate. What's your one big demand for the next EU mandate? Hannah, over to you.
You mentioned, Mary, that we have to speak about something that was mentioned previously. Well, Belarus was not mentioned throughout the entire discussion in the past 1 hour and a half. And I think it's sad, because what would have happened if in 2020 we would have won, if the revolution in Belarus would be successful? Who knows, maybe Putin would not have started the war, because Belarus was crucial, the territory of Belarus was crucial in the attack on Kiev and in the attack on Ukraine. And Lukashenko is the only material ally of Putin in this war. So I would like the EU to make Free Belarus a priority in the same way that Putin makes Belarus a dictatorial priority for him, because he sees a lot of geopolitical value there. And when I mentioned concrete steps like sanctions, many things have been done, and we are really grateful to the EU for all the sanctions that have been adopted. However, there are many loopholes and there are derogations that are still in place, and these loopholes have to be closed. And this is really serious. We are talking about oligarchs who are avoiding sanctions. The Commissioner mentioned the tribunal and justice. In the same way that we're talking about justice for Putin, we have to be talking about justice for Lukashenko, because he's also a war criminal and he's helping Putin in abduction of Ukrainian children. So let us make Free Belarus priority, and let us remember who Lukashenko is and that he has to be punished.
Thank you, Hannah. Didier, over to you.
No, thank you. Just three brief remarks and then a response to your question. Because I've listened to a lot of things, and I want to respond about first corruption. I've listened many comments on corruption also in Europe, but I want to say that for the first time we have put into place a real capacity to investigate and prosecute from the EU level. We have for the first time a European Prosecutor Office, and it's very new, but it's very efficient in different places in Europe. And we are fighting for the independence of the justice system and for the independence of the prosecutors, and you have seen that due to that, sometimes it's possible also in the recent days to see some investigations in different member states, but also in the European institutions. So there are not so many places in the world where it's possible for independent judges to organize such a process. We require to continue, and it's the second chapter of the rule of law report. It's dedicated to the fight against corruption and to improve that. About AI, the second remark, it's true that we need to continue to work. But what we try to do with our new legislative framework on digitalization in general and on AI in particular is the same that we've tried to do with the data protection and the privacy. We were the first in the world to come with the GDPR. Now it's more and more the rule on the 5 continents. Not exactly the same, but more and more. With AI Act, we try to do the same, to give a real impulse to international rules on the basis of on our values, and that's very important to try to do that. Third, on the foreign policy, I know that there are many discussions on double standards, but when I'm looking to the situation in the Middle East, there is no contradiction, but we need to do both, between the condemnation of a terrorist attack from a terrorist group, Hamas, in Israel, with many victims, and a request for full respect for international humanitarian law. And what we try to do now is, for the moment, the conference in Paris, on the proposal of the French president with support of the European Union, to try to do what? To increase the humanitarian support, but also to have an access to the civilians, because it's very important to do both, to increase the humanitarian support is fine, but we need to have real access on the ground. And we try to do that. So there's no contradiction between that. But I fully share the view of Federica. We have worked on this during many times. It's not to have a one voice. It's more to have one message, maybe with some nuances, but at least one message repeated by the Open Authority. And for the next mandate, if I may, during this mandate, we have tried to push forward many new legislations, the Green Deal, the digital framework, and so on. Now it's time for enforcement and implementation, but also for the values. We need to continue to enforce what we have to have a better level of full respect for democracy, human rights, and the rule of law in the EU, in the candidates for the next accession, but also in all the different places in the world where we have a role to play. And that's very important. And I'm sure that in the next mandate it will be maybe the first issue to try to come with a better enforcement of what we have, because we have a lot of tools.
Thank you very much, Didier. Federica, over to you.
Yes, one reaction and one idea for the future of future mandates, not an original one, but one I believe a lot in. First reaction is on the interest values debate. You would have expected it from me, probably. I really think that this is a trap. I think that we have, as Europeans, and as European Union in particular, actually, I think our interest is uphold our values. And that in the world of today, where it seems that the concept, even the concept of cooperation and governance and even working for peace, which is a word that is disappearing from the radar screen internationally, seems to be definitely not a trendy one. I think that actually it's not only a value of the European Union, it's an interest of the European Union to make sure that a cooperative approach to international affairs and to institutional work in general is revised, is reviewed, because it's somehow it's our history, it's our DNA, it's what we found out on our own skin, that actually cooperating is more convenient than making war. And now at a world level, this narrative seems to be completely disappearing. And I think that we have an interest. It's not because we are naive that we insist on being cooperative worldwide. I think it's because we know that it's in our interest, also because you need international cooperation, you need global governance also to work on your, including economic interest, trade, investments, and so on and so forth. Development needs security and stability. So I really would like to see that the debate about interest and values is not taken in a binary way, but is actually taken together. And if I could have a plea for the next mandate, would be to make sure that by the end of the next mandate, member states are not 27 anymore, but 28, 29, 30 probably, and to have new member states before the end of the next mandate, in particular with a look at the Balkans, because you're perfectly right, we will not be there forever, as they are somehow projected towards the European Union. And I think that there is a good perspective for that to happen. And I hope that this can happen with or without internal reforms, but without the issue of having internal reforms to have the EU ready for enlargement, that this doesn't become a way to postpone the enlargement in the future.
Christian, the last word.
Thank you. Well, I can say I agree with Federica Mogherini. In fact, the points you made were the ones I wanted to make. No, but and repetition is the mother to all learning, isn't it? So on the value interest, I think we must see that as one. Our interest is our values are our interest. And that goes internally and it goes externally. And that's how we have influence, in fact. And in particular these days with so much being questioned about global governance, about the way that we work together is even more important than before. Maybe one new point, and that is Ukraine. I think looking now ahead for the next mandate, I think what's going to be essential is that we are able to be resilient in our support for Ukraine and for Ukraine's fight against this unacceptable invasion. I think that's going to be a challenge, but that is something where I would hope that the mandate of the next commissioner will be very clear on that point and that the investments will be done in that respect. And finally, on enlargement, I think that is one thing which next mandate will have to deliver on. Whether it goes as far as Federica Mogherini points to, I don't know, but what needs to be the case is that this is a priority, and that has to do with values. Because what we are doing is that we are projecting the values and our interests to the Western Balkan by, I would argue, exporting stability instead of importing instability, and that is essential for us.